Hello, my dear friends. My name is Margaret, and I'm 79 years old. What I'm about to share with you is something I've carried in my heart for decades. A burden so heavy that some nights I wondered if I'd ever find the courage to speak it aloud. This is a story about love, about betrayal, and about a discovery so shocking that it shattered everything I thought I knew about my own life. If you're watching this right now, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps me reach more people who might need to hear that they're not alone in their pain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to a time when the world seemed simpler, though perhaps it never really was. It was 1968, and I was barely 21 years old, fresh out of a 2-year secretarial program at the community college in Portland, Oregon. My parents had scrimped and saved to afford that education for me, their only daughter, believing that office skills would give me a respectable career and a chance at a better life than they'd had. My father worked at the lumber mill, and my mother took in ironing from the wealthier families on the hill. They were good, honest people who believed in hard work, faith, and family above all else. I met Richard Callahan at a church social in the spring of that year. He was 25, tall and handsome in that clean-cut way that mothers approved of. With dark hair he kept neatly combed and eyes that seemed to sparkle with ambition. He worked as a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company, traveling throughout Oregon and Washington to visit doctors' offices and hospitals. It was considered an excellent position back then, respectable and with good earning potential. Richard had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he spoke to you. He'd lean in close, give you his full attention, and listen as if every word you said mattered profoundly. Our courtship was brief by today's standards but perfectly normal for that era. We dated for 8 months, always properly chaperoned at first, with my parents watching carefully from the corners of rooms or sitting in the front seat while Richard drove us to the movies. He brought flowers to my mother, spoke respectfully to my father about his intentions, and attended church services with us every Sunday. By November, he'd proposed, presenting me with a modest diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes without hesitation, swept up in the romance of it all, in the dream of becoming Mrs. Richard Callahan and starting a family of my own. We married in February of 1969 in a small ceremony at Our Lady of Sorrows Church. I wore my mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of white roses that Richard had insisted on ordering from the finest florist in Portland. The reception was held in the church hall, with punch and cake and dancing to records played on someone's portable phonograph. It felt like a fairy tale, like the beginning of everything I'd ever wanted. Looking back now with all these years behind me, I can see how naive I was, how blindly I walked into a situation I should have questioned more carefully. But hindsight is a cruel gift, isn't it? It shows us all the signs we missed, all the red flags we overlooked, because we wanted so desperately to believe in the story we were telling ourselves. Richard and I moved into a small apartment on the east side of Portland, a second-floor walk-up with 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that barely fit our second-hand sofa and the television set his parents had given us as a wedding gift. I took a job as a secretary at an insurance company downtown, typing policies and answering phones while Richard continued his sales routes. He was gone often, sometimes 3 or 4 days at a time, traveling to the smaller towns scattered throughout Oregon and southern Washington. Spokane was a regular destination, he told me, and sometimes he'd venture as far as Boise when the company had special promotions or new products to introduce. Those absences were hard at first. I was a newlywed, eager to build a life with my husband, and instead I spent many evenings alone in that little apartment, eating dinner by myself and falling asleep to the sound of the television. But Richard always called when he was away, usually around 7 in the evening, to tell me about his day and ask about mine. He'd describe the doctors he'd met, the interesting cases he'd heard about, the challenges of staying in small-town motels where the beds were lumpy and the coffee was weak. I'd share stories from the office, tell him what I'd made for dinner even though I'd eaten it alone, and count the days until he'd be home again. When he returned from his trips, Richard was always affectionate and attentive. He'd bring me small gifts, a silk scarf from a boutique in Eugene, a bottle of perfume he'd seen in a department store window in Salem, a book he thought I'd enjoy. We'd go out to dinner or he'd take me dancing, And for those brief days when he was home, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The pattern became our normal. 3 or 4 days away, 2 or 3 days home, then away again. I learned to adjust, to fill my time with work and friendships with other young wives in our building, with volunteer work at the church and visits to my parents on Sunday afternoons. Our daughter Jennifer was born in January of 1970, exactly 11 months after our wedding. The pregnancy had been difficult, with severe morning sickness that lasted well into my second trimester and complications near the end that had the doctor worried. But when I finally held that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, every moment of discomfort was forgotten. She had Richard's dark hair and my green eyes, and from the very beginning, she was the center of my universe. Richard seemed pleased to have a daughter, though I noticed he was less hands-on than some of the other new fathers I knew. He loved Jennifer, I never doubted that, but he also seemed relieved when his sales routes called him away, and he could leave the midnight feedings and diaper changes to me. I quit my job at the insurance company to stay home with Jennifer, and we moved to a slightly larger apartment with 2 bedrooms and a small balcony where I could hang laundry to dry in the summer months. Money was tighter with only Richard's income, but we managed. I learned to be frugal, clipping coupons from the newspaper, buying day-old bread from the bakery, sewing many of Jennifer's clothes myself from patterns and fabric scraps I found at the 5 and dime. Richard continued to travel, and I continued to accept it as the price we paid for his career, for the steady paycheck that kept a roof over our heads and food on our table. Jennifer was a bright, curious child who walked early and spoke in full sentences before her 2nd birthday. She had a stubborn streak that matched my own and a charm that she must have inherited from her father. As she grew, I delighted in every milestone, every new word and discovery, every scraped knee and bedtime story. On the nights when Richard was home, he'd read to her from picture books, his deep voice making the characters come alive, and Jennifer would giggle and beg for just one more story. Those were the good times, the moments I held on to when loneliness crept in during his absences. It was around Jennifer's 3rd birthday that I first noticed something odd, though at the time I dismissed it as mere coincidence. Richard had mentioned he'd be in Spokane for an extended trip, nearly a week, because the company was launching a new product line and needed their sales representatives to conduct training sessions with medical staff at the larger hospitals. I thought nothing of it until my cousin Dorothy called one evening while Richard was supposedly in Spokane. Dorothy lived in Seattle and worked as a nurse at Swedish Hospital. She was calling to chat, to catch up on family news, and somewhere in the conversation she mentioned that she'd seen a pharmaceutical sales rep that day who reminded her so much of Richard. Tall, dark-haired, same confident manner, she said with a laugh. For a second I actually thought it was him, but of course it couldn't be. You said he was in Spokane this week. I agreed, laughing along with her, but something about the comment stuck with me. Seattle was in the opposite direction from Spokane. If Richard was where he said he was, there was no reason he'd be at a hospital in Seattle. Unless Dorothy had been mistaken about the day, or unless the man she'd seen was simply someone who resembled my husband. I pushed the thought away, refusing to let suspicion take root. Richard had never given me any real reason to doubt him. He was a good provider, a loving father when he was home, and a faithful husband as far as I knew. 2 years passed, then 3, then 5. Jennifer started kindergarten, and I volunteered in her classroom, helping the teacher with art projects and reading groups. Richard's career continued to flourish. He received promotions and pay raises, and we were finally able to afford a small house in a modest neighborhood in Northeast Portland. It had 3 bedrooms, a fenced backyard where Jennifer could play, and a garage where Richard could park his company car. To the outside world, we were a picture of suburban success, the American dream realized. But there were cracks in that picture, small fissures that I noticed but couldn't quite explain. Richard's trips seemed to be getting longer and more frequent. He'd sometimes be gone for 6 or 7 days at a stretch, and when I asked about it, he'd explain that the company was expanding into new territories, that competition was fierce and he needed to work harder to maintain his sales numbers. The phone calls that had once been a nightly ritual during his absences became less frequent. Some evenings he wouldn't call at all, and when I asked why the next time I heard from him, he'd say he'd gotten back to the motel too late or he'd been entertaining clients over dinner and drinks. There were other small things too. Once, when going through Richard's wallet to find a receipt for our tax records, I discovered a business card from a restaurant in Spokane called the Davenport Grill. On the back, Someone had written a date and time in handwriting that wasn't Richard's. When I asked him about it, he barely glanced at the card before explaining that a client had recommended the place for a business dinner and had jotted down a reservation time. It made sense, but something about his dismissive manner bothered me. Another time, I was sorting laundry and found a movie ticket stub in his pants pocket from a theater in Olympia. The date on the stub was from a Thursday, a day when Richard had told me he was conducting training sessions at a hospital. When I mentioned it, he laughed and said he'd finished early and caught a film to kill time before his next appointment the following morning. Again, a reasonable explanation, but it left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I tried talking to my mother about these niggling doubts carefully, without voicing direct suspicions. She reminded me that marriage required trust, that men needed to work and provide, and that it was a wife's duty to support her husband's career, even when it meant sacrifice. She warned me against the dangers of a suspicious mind, saying that baseless jealousy could poison even the happiest marriage. I took her words to heart and pushed my concerns deeper, buried them under the daily routines of cooking and cleaning, of raising Jennifer, of maintaining our home and our life together. Jennifer was 9 years old when something happened that I couldn't dismiss or explain away. It was a Saturday afternoon in October, and Richard was home for the weekend, a rare treat. We'd planned a family outing to the zoo, something Jennifer had been excited about for days. That morning, the phone rang while Richard was in the shower. I answered, expecting it might be my mother or one of the neighbors. Instead, a woman's voice asked, "Is Richard there?" The voice was pleasant, professional, and I assumed it was someone from his company calling about work even on a weekend. "He's not available at the moment," I replied. "This is his wife. May I take a message?" There was a pause, a beat of silence that lasted just a fraction too long. Then the woman said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I must have the wrong number," and hung up abruptly. Something about that call bothered me deeply. The way she'd asked for Richard by his first name, so familiar. The pause when I identified myself as his wife. The hasty disconnect without even asking if I was sure she had the wrong number. When Richard came out of the bathroom, toweling his hair, I mentioned the call casually, testing his reaction. He frowned, said it was probably someone from the office who'd forgotten it was the weekend, and changed the subject. But I'd seen something flicker across his face, just for an instant. Alarm? Guilt? I couldn't be sure, but I knew I'd seen something. Over the next few months, I became more alert to details, more observant of inconsistencies. I noticed that Richard had started doing his own laundry when he returned from trips, something he'd never done before. He'd unpack his suitcase immediately and throw everything into the washing machine before I had a chance to sort through his clothes. When I commented that he didn't need to do that laundry was my job, he said he'd gotten into the habit because his clothes reeked of cigarette smoke from the motels and restaurants where he spent so much time. I noticed he'd started keeping his briefcase locked, something else that was new. When I asked about it, once curious, he said the company had implemented new security policies regarding proprietary information and sample medications. Again, a reasonable explanation, but it felt wrong somehow. I noticed that when the phone rang in the evening while he was home, he'd sometimes glance at it with an expression I couldn't quite read before letting me answer. And once or twice, I caught him quickly ending a phone conversation when I walked into the room, claiming it was just a colleague talking shop and he didn't want to bore me with work talk. The final straw, the thing that pushed me from vague suspicion into active investigation, happened in the spring of 1979. Jennifer was 9.5 and she'd started taking an interest in her father's work, asking questions about what he did on his trips, what the different medicines he sold were for, whether she could come with him sometime and see what traveling was like. Richard always deflected these questions gently, saying his work was boring and she'd be much happier at home with her friends and her mother. One evening, Jennifer was drawing pictures at the kitchen table while I prepared dinner. Richard was in the living room reading the newspaper. Jennifer suddenly called out, "Daddy, how do you spell Spokane?" Richard looked up from his paper. "Why do you need to spell Spokane, sweetheart?" "Because I'm making a map of all the places you go for work," Jennifer replied, holding up a piece of paper covered with her careful child's handwriting and drawings. "I already have Portland and Seattle and Salem. Now I need Spokane." Richard got up and walked over to look at her map, and I saw his face change, saw a tension enter his shoulders. That's very creative, honey, but you don't need to include every place I visit. There are too many. Just put Portland and Oregon and that will be enough. But Jennifer was persistent as children can be. But you talk about Spokane all the time. You said you were there last week and the week before that. I want to put it on my map. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I was paying attention now, watching this exchange with sudden focus. I don't talk about Spokane all the time, he said, his voice a bit sharper than necessary. And I wasn't there last week. You must be confused. Jennifer's face fell, hurt by her father's tone. She looked down at her paper. But you said. Richard cut her off. Margaret, dinner smells wonderful. Why don't you help Jennifer put away her art supplies so we can eat? It was a clear signal to drop the subject, and Jennifer, sensitive to her father's moods, quickly gathered her papers and crayons without another word. But I couldn't let it go so easily. Later that night, after Jennifer was in bed, I asked Richard about the exchange. She's just a child trying to show interest in your work. Why did you shut her down like that? He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I was giving him a headache. Because I don't want her making maps and asking questions at school about where I go. It's nobody's business but ours. I felt a chill run through me. Why would it matter if she talked about it at school? What was there to hide? We continued to argue in hushed voices, not wanting to wake Jennifer. And finally Richard said he was tired and going to bed. The conversation was over, but the questions remained. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside Richard, listening to him breathe. And I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that something was very wrong. My husband was hiding something from me, something significant, and I needed to know what it was. The next morning, after Richard left for another trip, this time supposedly to cover several small towns in eastern Oregon, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, whatever it took. I started with the obvious. I went through Richard's home office, carefully searching through files and papers, looking for anything unusual. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected. Sales reports, promotional materials for medications, correspondence with doctors' offices and hospitals, expense reports for meals and lodging. But tucked in the back of one filing cabinet drawer, I found a folder that gave me pause. It contained receipts and statements from a bank I didn't recognize. Not the local branch where we kept our checking and savings accounts. The statements were for a checking account in Richard's name only, and they showed regular deposits and withdrawals. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were substantial enough to make me wonder where this money was coming from and what it was being used for. Richard's paychecks were directly deposited into our joint account. Where was this other money coming from? I photographed several of the statements with my Polaroid camera, my hands shaking slightly, and carefully returned everything to its place. Over the following weeks, while Richard was away on his trips, I became a detective in my own marriage. I went through every pocket of every piece of clothing in his closet. I found more receipts, more ticket stubs, more small slips of paper that documented a life I wasn't part of. A receipt from a jewelry store in Spokane for a purchase made 6 months earlier. I'd received no jewelry from Richard in that time. A receipt from a florist, also in Spokane, dated on a day that wasn't my birthday or our anniversary. Ticket stubs from movies and concerts, always in Spokane or occasionally in Seattle, on dates when Richard had told me he was working. I found a key hidden in a small box at the back of his sock drawer. It was attached to a plastic tag with the number 247 written in marker. A motel room key, perhaps? Or something else? I took photographs of everything, building a file of evidence without yet knowing what it all meant. I called the bank whose statements I'd found and, pretending to be updating our account information, learned that the branch was located in Spokane. Of course it was. Everything seemed to lead back to Spokane. One afternoon, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I called Richard's office and asked to speak with his manager, claiming I needed to verify some dates for our tax records. The secretary was helpful, patching me through to a Mr. Henderson, who'd supervised Richard for years. I explained that I needed to confirm which days in March my husband had been traveling for business purposes, saying our accountant had questions about some expense deductions. Mr. Henderson was happy to help. He pulled Richard's travel schedule and read off the dates. But there was a problem. According to the official records, Richard had been scheduled for trips to Salem, Eugene, and Medford in March. No trips to Spokane. No extended journeys to Eastern Oregon. The dates Richard had told me he'd be away matched, but the destinations didn't. When I asked specifically about Spokane, Mr. Henderson said the company didn't have many clients in that region and Richard rarely had reason to go there. Perhaps once or twice a year at most. I thanked him and hung up, my mind reeling. Richard was lying about where he went on his trips. He was going to Spokane when he told me and his employer he was going elsewhere. He had a separate bank account I knew nothing about. He was spending money on jewelry and flowers and entertainment that wasn't for me. There could be only one explanation, and it was the one I'd been desperately trying not to consider. My husband was having an affair. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the photographs and receipts I'd collected, and felt my world crumbling. 13 years of marriage. A daughter who adored her father. A life I'd built on what I thought was solid ground, and all of it was built on lies. But even in my grief and anger, I knew I needed more concrete proof before I confronted him. I needed to know who she was, this woman in Spokane. I needed to understand the full scope of Richard's betrayal before I decided what to do about it. It took me 3 more weeks to gather the courage for what I did next. I told Richard the first was taking Jennifer to visit my aunt in Seattle for a few days during her spring break from school. My aunt was elderly and lonely, I explained, and would love to see her great niece. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper when I mentioned it, just nodded and said that sounded nice. He'd be away on a trip anyway, he said, so the timing worked out well. I knew from his travel calendar that he was supposedly going to be in Medford and Grants Pass. I also knew, or at least strongly suspected, that he'd actually be in Spokane. I dropped Jennifer off at my mother's house the morning Richard left for his trip. My mother was thrilled to have her granddaughter for a few days and asked no questions about why I wasn't staying too. I told her I had some personal business to take care of and would pick Jennifer up in 3 days. Then I did something I'd never done in my 13 years of marriage. I lied to my husband. I called Richard at the motel where he said he'd be staying in Medford and left a message saying Jennifer and I had arrived safely in Seattle. I knew he wouldn't call the house to check because he thought we were away. Then I drove to Spokane. It took about 6 hours, straight across the Columbia River Gorge, and into eastern Washington. I'd withdrawn money from our savings account, enough for a motel room and meals and whatever else I might need. I had the address of the bank branch where Richard kept his secret account. I had the photographs of all the receipts I'd collected, many of them from businesses in Spokane. I had a key with the number 247 on it, and I had a determination to finally learn the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I arrived in Spokane in the late afternoon and checked into a modest motel near the downtown area. I was exhausted from the drive and from the anxiety that had been building for weeks, but I couldn't rest. I drove to the address of the jewelry store where Richard had made that purchase 6 months earlier. It was a small, elegant shop on a tree-lined street. I went inside, my heart pounding, and pretended to browse while trying to build up courage. Finally, I approached the woman behind the counter. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "My husband made a purchase here several months ago, and I'm trying to find out what he bought. I want to make sure I have the right size or style for something similar." She smiled politely. "Of course. Do you have the receipt or know the date of purchase?" I showed her the photographed receipt. She examined it and went to check her records. When she returned, she was still smiling. "Oh yes, I remember this. A lovely sapphire pendant on a white gold chain. Your husband said it was for someone very special. He seemed quite particular about choosing just the right piece." My stomach turned over. I forced myself to smile back. "Yes, that sounds right. Thank you." I left the shop quickly, before she could see the tears starting in my eyes. A sapphire pendant. I didn't own a sapphire pendant. Richard had given me no jewelry at all in recent years, claiming money was tight and we needed to save. But he'd bought an expensive pendant for someone else, someone very special. I sat in my car for a long time trying to compose myself. Then I drove to the florist whose receipt I'd also found. I repeated my performance, pretending to be a wife checking on her husband's thoughtful gesture. The florist, an older woman with kind eyes, consulted her records and told me Richard had ordered roses. Red roses, a dozen of them, delivered to an address in a residential neighborhood. She gave me the address without hesitation, probably thinking I was the recipient and had simply forgotten to write it down. I drove to that address as the sun was setting, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. It was a pleasant neighborhood of modest single-family homes, the kind where young families lived, where children played in yards and people knew their neighbors. I found the house number and parked across the street, not knowing what I expected to see or what I would do if I saw anything. The house was a small ranch-style home painted pale blue with white trim. There was a car in the driveway, a newer model sedan. Lights were on inside. I sat there for nearly an hour waiting for I don't know what. Just as I was about to give up and drive back to my motel, the front door opened and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was younger than me, perhaps in her late 20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was pretty in a fresh-faced way, wearing jeans and a sweater. And she wasn't alone. A young girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, came out with her laughing at something. The woman smiled down at the child, and even from across the street in the fading light, I could see the affection between them. My breath caught in my throat. A child. He'd not only been having an affair, but there was a child. I watched as they got into the car and backed out of the driveway. I followed them, keeping several car lengths behind, my heart racing. They drove to a grocery store, and I watched from my car as they went inside together, the woman holding the little girl's hand. They were in there for about 20 minutes, and when they emerged, the child was carrying a small bag and eating an ice cream cone. I followed them back to the house and watched them go inside. Lights came on in different rooms, and through the window I could see movement, the ordinary activities of an ordinary evening. Making dinner maybe, or getting ready for bedtime. The woman passed by a window at one point, and I saw her more clearly in the interior light. She looked tired but happy, the way young mothers do. My mind was churning. Who was she? Was she Richard's mistress? And the child, was she Richard's daughter? I had a half-formed idea that I would knock on that door right then, demand answers, confront this woman and find out what she knew about my husband. But I didn't. I was afraid of what I might learn, afraid of what it would mean for Jennifer and for me if this turned out to be what I suspected. Instead, I drove back to my motel and spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, going over everything I knew and everything I didn't know. The next morning, I returned to the blue house. The car was gone from the driveway. I waited until mid-morning, then I did something bold. I walked up to the front door and knocked. No one answered. I tried the neighbors, knocking on the door of the house to the right. An elderly man answered, friendly and curious about the stranger on his doorstep. "I'm looking for the woman who lives next door," I said, improvising quickly. "We're old friends from college and I've lost touch with her. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by, but she doesn't seem to be home." "Oh, you mean Linda," the man said. "Nice young lady. She works during the day. Usually gets home around 5:30 or 6. You might try back then." Linda. Now I had a name. "Does she live alone?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just her and her little girl Emily," the man said. "Husband travels a lot for work," she told me. "Pharmaceutical sales, I think. Something like that. So they don't see him much, but Linda manages just fine on her own. She's a real trooper." I felt the blood drain from my face. I thanked the man and walked back to my car on legs that barely supported me. A husband who travels for pharmaceutical sales. A husband she doesn't see much. It was Richard. It had to be Richard. He hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been living a double life. He had another family, another wife, another daughter. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind unable to process what I'd learned. Finally, I found myself at a park and sat on a bench, watching children play on the swings and slides. Children like Emily. Children like Jennifer. Both of them innocent. Both of them believing in their father. Both of them not knowing that they had a sister they'd never met. How long had this been going on? Since before Jennifer was born? Had Richard married this Linda? Or were they just living together? Did she know about me and Jennifer? Or did she think, as I had, that she was Richard's only wife, his only family? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. I knew I couldn't go back home and pretend nothing had changed. I knew I had to confront Richard. But I also knew I needed more information first. I needed to understand the full picture before I decided what to do. How to protect Jennifer. How to handle the aftermath of this revelation. That afternoon I went to the library and looked up public records. I found a marriage license for Richard James Callahan and Linda Marie Foster, dated August 1973. 6 years ago. 3 years after he'd married me. He was a bigamist. He'd committed a crime by marrying Linda while still married to me. The realization was almost too much to bear. I photographed the marriage license with my camera, adding it to my growing file of evidence. Then I drove back to the blue house and waited. At 6 o'clock, Linda's car pulled into the driveway. She got out, helped Emily out of the back seat, and they walked to the house together. I watched them disappear inside and I knew what I had to do. I had to talk to Linda. I had to know if she was aware of me and Jennifer, if she was a willing participant in Richard's deception or another victim like myself. But not tonight. Tonight I needed to go back to my motel and plan what I would say, how I would approach a conversation that would destroy both our worlds. Tomorrow. I would do it tomorrow. I would knock on that door and meet the woman who'd been sharing my husband, and then somehow I would figure out what came next. The next morning arrived with a gray drizzly rain that matched my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept, rehearsing different versions of the conversation I needed to have with Linda. How do you introduce yourself to the woman who's been living with your husband? What words could possibly encompass the magnitude of what we were both about to discover? I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress and cardigan, wanting to look respectable and composed even though I felt like I was falling apart inside. I checked out of the motel and drove to the blue house, arriving around 9 in the morning. The car was in the driveway, and I could see movement through the front window. I sat in my car for 10 minutes gathering courage, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Finally, I forced myself to open the door and walk up the path to the front porch. The garden was well maintained, with spring flowers beginning to bloom in neat beds along the walkway. Someone took pride in this home, and that somehow made everything worse. I raised my hand and knocked 3 firm raps that sounded too loud in the quiet morning. Footsteps approached and then the door opened. Linda stood there in jeans and a yellow blouse, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger up close, perhaps only 27 or 28, with clear blue eyes and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She smiled politely, the way you do when a stranger appears at your door. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, pleasant, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. I opened my mouth and found I'd forgotten every carefully rehearsed word. Instead, what came out was simply, "My name is Margaret Callahan. I need to talk to you about Richard." The change in her expression was instantaneous. The polite smile vanished, replaced by confusion, then shock, then something that looked like fear. Her hand gripped the doorframe. "Richard." Her voice had gone thin, uncertain. "You know Richard?" "I'm his wife," I said quietly. "We've been married for 13 years. We have a daughter named Jennifer. She's 9 years old." The color drained from Linda's face. She swayed slightly, and for a moment I thought she might faint. Then she steadied herself and looked at me with eyes that had gone hard. "That's impossible. I'm Richard's wife. We've been married for 6 years. We have a daughter named Emily. She's 5 years old." We stood there staring at each other, 2 women whose entire worlds had just shifted on their axis. I saw my own shock and horror reflected in her face. Neither of us was the other woman. We were both wives, both mothers, both victims of the same elaborate deception. "May I come in?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Linda hesitated, then stepped back and opened the door wider. I followed her into a living room that was cozy and cheerful, with toys scattered on the floor and family photographs on the mantel. Photographs of Richard with Linda, Richard holding a baby, Richard pushing a little girl on a swing. A whole life documented in frames, a life that existed parallel to mine. "Where's Emily?" I asked, suddenly aware that a child might witness this conversation. "Kindergarten," Linda replied mechanically. "I drop her off at 8:30. She gets home at 3. We sat down, Linda on the sofa and me in an armchair across from her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Linda said, "Show me proof. Show me you're really married to him." I reached into my purse and pulled out my wedding photograph, the one I always carried in my wallet. Linda took it with shaking hands and stared at the image of me in my mother's altered wedding dress, standing beside Richard in his rented tuxedo. The date was written on the back. February 14th, 1969. Linda set the photo down on the coffee table and got up without a word. She left the room and returned a moment later with her own wedding album. She opened it to the first page and there was Richard again, 6 years younger than in my photo but unmistakably the same man, standing beside Linda in her white gown. The date on their photo was August 3, 1973. She handed me their marriage license, the same one I'd found in the public records. I gave her mine, which I'd brought with me from Portland. We sat there exchanging documents of our marriages, proof of our separate lives with the same man, and the reality of it settled over us like a suffocating blanket. How? Linda finally asked, her voice breaking. How is this possible? How could he do this? I've been trying to figure that out since yesterday, I admitted. His job gives him the perfect cover. He travels constantly, or at least that's what he tells both of us. When he's with you, I think he's working. When he's with me, you think he's working. But really he's just going back and forth between two families. Linda pressed her hands to her face. Oh God. Oh my God. I thought I was going crazy sometimes. He's gone so much 3 or 4 days a week. He says it's his sales territory, that his route covers so much ground. I believed him. I trusted him completely. I know I said softly. So did I. For 13 years I trusted him completely. We talked for hours that morning, comparing notes on our marriages, and the picture that emerged was both intricate and damning. Richard had constructed 2 entirely separate lives with remarkable precision. With me, he was Richard Callahan from Portland, married in 1969, father to Jennifer. With Linda, he was Richard Callahan from Seattle, married in 1973, father to Emily. He told Linda his parents were dead, just as he'd told me. He told her he had no siblings, the same lie he'd given me. He'd created a complete fictional background for himself that he could maintain with both of us. The financial details were particularly galling. Richard had clearly been earning more than he'd ever let on. His base salary plus commissions had allowed him to support 2 households, though neither of us had lived extravagantly. Linda worked part-time as a dental hygienist, and her income supplemented what Richard gave her, just as my former secretarial work had supplemented our household before Jennifer was born. Neither of us had questioned why we couldn't afford more, why vacations were rare, why Richard was always careful with money. We'd accepted his explanations about expenses and saving for the future. Did he ever talk about wanting more children? I asked Linda at one point. She shook her head. He always said Emily was enough, that we should focus on giving her the best life possible rather than stretching ourselves thin with more kids. What about you? I laughed bitterly. He said the same thing about Jennifer. That one child was perfect and we shouldn't complicate our lives. Now I understand why. He was already juggling 2 families. More children would have made it impossible. Linda got up and made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table drinking it while rain pattered against the windows. I found myself studying her, this woman who'd shared my husband, and I felt no anger toward her. How could I? She was as deceived as I was, perhaps even more so since I'd at least had the first claim on Richard. She'd entered into marriage believing she was his only wife, his only love. Where is he now? Linda asked suddenly. Do you know? He thinks I'm in Seattle visiting relatives, I said. He's supposedly on a business trip to Southern Oregon, but I suspect he might be here in Spokane with you. Linda's eyes widened. No. He called last night and said he was in Eugene. Said he'd be on the road all week and would try to call again tomorrow. So he's lying to both of us about where he is, I said. He could be anywhere. Or he could be on his way here, I thought with sudden alarm. What time does he usually arrive when he comes to stay with you? Usually late afternoon or evening, Linda replied. He says he tries to finish his appointments by 3, so he can be home for dinner with Emily and me. We need to be prepared, I said. He can't know we've talked yet. Not until we decide what we want to do. Linda looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. What can we do? He's committed bigamy. That's a crime. We could go to the police. I agreed. But then what? He goes to jail, loses his job, and both of our families are destroyed financially. Jennifer and Emily would grow up knowing their father is a criminal. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying we need to think through all the implications. Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. I want to meet her. Jennifer. Your daughter. I want to meet my daughter's sister. The request caught me off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered how we would navigate the relationship between our children. Jennifer doesn't know anything about this yet, I said carefully. I haven't told her. She thinks her father is on a business trip and I'm handling some personal matters. How can I tell her that her father has another family? That she has a sister she never knew about? Linda's face crumpled. How can I tell Emily? She adores her father. This will destroy her. We sat in silence, two mothers trying to protect children from a truth that would shatter their understanding of their family, their father, their entire world. I thought about Jennifer's map, the one she'd been making of Richard's travels, and how he'd shut down her innocent questions. He'd been afraid she'd start asking questions he couldn't answer, afraid the two halves of his double life would collide. I thought about all the times he'd been distant or preoccupied, and I realized he must have been carrying an enormous burden of lies. How exhausting it must have been to keep everything straight, to remember which stories he'd told which wife, to maintain two completely separate identities. Tell me about Emily, I said to Linda. What's she like? Linda's face softened despite her tears. She's bright and funny. She loves to draw and make up stories. She's obsessed with butterflies right now, has a whole collection of pictures and books about them. She's shy around strangers but opens up once she feels comfortable. She wants a puppy more than anything in the world, but Richard keeps saying we need to wait until we have a bigger house. What about Jennifer? Jennifer is stubborn and determined, I said, smiling despite everything. She reads constantly advanced chapter books that are meant for children years older. She wants to be a teacher when she grows up. She plays piano, not particularly well but with great enthusiasm. She has Richard's dark hair and my green eyes, and she has this way of tilting her head when she's thinking hard about something that reminds me so much of my mother. As I described my daughter, I watched Linda's face and saw longing there, a desire to know this child who was connected to her Emily through their shared father. Do they look alike? Linda asked softly. I don't know, I admitted. I've only seen Emily from a distance. Do you have a picture? Linda got up and retrieved a photo album, the kind families keep to document birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments. She opened it to a recent page and showed me a photograph of Emily blowing out candles on a birthday cake. I studied the little girl's face and felt my breath catch. She had Richard's dark hair like Jennifer, but her features were different, softer, more like Linda's. Yet there was something in her expression, a certain intensity in her eyes, that reminded me strongly of Jennifer. They have the same father, I said quietly. That makes them half-sisters. They should know each other. They should have the chance to be sisters if they want to. But how? Linda asked helplessly. How do we do this without destroying them? I don't know, I admitted. But we have to figure it out. We have to do what's best for them, not just react out of our own anger and hurt. We spent the rest of the morning making plans, discussing possibilities, trying to think through the complex situation we found ourselves in. We agreed that we needed to confront Richard together, to present a united front so he couldn't manipulate or lie to either of us anymore. We agreed that we needed to protect our daughters as much as possible from the ugliest aspects of what their father had done. We agreed that whatever happened next, we wouldn't let Richard's betrayal poison the potential relationship between Jennifer and Emily. Around 2 o'clock, Linda had to leave to pick up Emily from kindergarten. Do you want to meet her? She asked hesitantly. Or is it too soon? I thought about it. Part of me desperately wanted to see this child who was Jennifer's sister. But another part knew it would be overwhelming for Emily to meet a stranger, who would then have to be explained. Not yet, I said. Let's wait until we've talked to Richard, until we know what we're dealing with. Then we can introduce them properly. Linda nodded, relief evident on her face. Where will you stay? Are you going back to Portland? I shook my head. I'm going to get another motel room here in Spokane. I need to be here when Richard arrives, whenever that is. We need to do this soon, Linda. Every day we wait is another day of lies. I know, she agreed. When he calls tonight, I'll ask when he's planning to come home. Then we can set up a time to confront him together. We exchanged phone numbers, and I gave her the name of the motel where I'd be staying. As I got up to leave, Linda reached out and touched my arm. Thank you, she said. For what? I asked, surprised. For not blaming me. For not hating me. I could see it in your eyes when you first arrived. You were prepared to hate me, but you don't. How could I hate you? I replied. You didn't know about me any more than I knew about you. We're both victims here. The only person to blame is Richard. Linda's eyes filled with tears again. I feel so stupid. How did I not see it? How did I not know? We both missed it, I said gently. He's had years to perfect his deception. He knew exactly what to say, how to explain his absences, how to keep us both satisfied and unsuspecting. This isn't on us. This is entirely on him. I left Linda's house and drove to a different motel than the one I'd stayed at the night before. I checked in and sat on the bed, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation with Linda had taken everything out of me emotionally. Now I had to wait for Richard to make his next move, to return to one of his families so we could finally force him to face what he'd done. That evening Linda called me. He phoned about an hour ago, she said. He's in Pendleton, or at least that's what he claims. He said he'd be here tomorrow evening around 6. He's planning to stay through the weekend. Tomorrow evening. That gave us a little over 24 hours to prepare. I'll be there, I told Linda. Maybe I should come around 7, after he's arrived and had time to get settled. That way he won't suspect anything when you answer the door. That makes sense, Linda agreed. Margaret. Her voice wavered. I'm scared. So am I admitted. But we'll face this together. We have to, for our daughter's sake. I spent a sleepless night in that motel room, alternating between anger and grief. I thought about 13 years of marriage, of believing I knew the man I'd chosen to spend my life with. I thought about all the nights I'd slept alone, trusting that Richard was working hard to provide for us. I thought about Jennifer, innocent and trusting, and how her world was about to be turned upside down. I thought about Linda and Emily, equally innocent, equally betrayed. And I thought about Richard, the man who'd managed to deceive us all for so long, and I wondered if he'd ever truly loved any of us or if we'd all just been conveniences, parts to play in the elaborate fiction he'd created for himself. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to eat breakfast but could barely swallow. I went for a walk in a nearby park, watching families together and wondering how many of them were built on lies like mine. I called my mother's house to check on Jennifer, using a payphone so Richard couldn't trace the call if he somehow checked records. My mother said Jennifer was fine, having a wonderful time baking cookies and playing in the garden. Hearing my daughter's laughter in the background nearly broke me. How was I going to tell her? How could I explain that her father wasn't who she thought he was? At 6:30 that evening, I drove to Linda's house. Richard's company car was in the driveway, confirming he'd arrived. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, breathing deeply, steadying myself for what was about to happen. Then I walked up to the door and knocked. Through the window, I could hear voices inside. Could hear Emily's high-pitched chatter and Richard's deeper response. Normal family sounds. A typical evening in what appeared to be a typical family. Linda opened the door. Her face was pale but composed. She'd clearly been crying earlier, but she'd pulled herself together. Come in, she said loudly enough for Richard to hear. Margaret is here, honey. I heard the sound of a chair scraping back, footsteps approaching. Then Richard appeared in the hallway, and I watched his face transform as he recognized me. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. His expression went from casual curiosity to confusion to recognition to absolute horror in the space of 3 seconds. Margaret, he said, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. What are you doing here? I thought you were in Seattle. Surprise, I said, and I was amazed at how calm my voice sounded. Turns out I had some business in Spokane instead. Imagine my surprise when I discovered my husband has been spending his business trips with his other family. Richard's face had gone gray. He looked from me to Linda and back again. I can explain, he started, but Linda cut him off. No, she said firmly. No more explanations. No more lies. We know everything, Richard. We know you married both of us. We know about the bigamy. We know you've been living 2 separate lives for years. Sit down. We need to talk. From upstairs came the sound of Emily calling out. Daddy, can you come help me with my puzzle? The sound of that innocent voice, so much like Jennifer's when she called for her father, nearly undid me. Linda called back. Daddy will be up in a few minutes, sweetie. Keep working on it. Richard sank into a chair, and I realized he was shaking. His carefully constructed world had just imploded, and he knew it. Linda and I sat across from him, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then I said, "How could you? How could you do this to us? To Jennifer and Emily? They're innocent children who love their father, and you've built their entire lives on lies." Richard's hands covered his face. "I never meant for it to happen like this. Just got out of control." "Out of control?" Linda's voice rose. "You married me while you were already married to Margaret. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't something that got out of control. That was a choice you made." "Talk," I said coldly. "Explain to us how this happened. And don't lie. We already know too much, and anything you say now will be verified." Richard looked up at us with defeated eyes. "I met Linda 2 years after Jennifer was born," he began. "I was doing sales calls in Spokane and I went into the dental office where she worked. We started talking and she was so young and pretty and interested in me. I was tired of the constant travel, tired of coming home to a wife who only talked about diapers and baby food." "That's not fair," I interrupted. "You were barely home. I was raising our daughter alone while you were supposedly building your career." "I know," Richard said miserably. "I know it's not fair. I'm not trying to justify what I did. You asked for an explanation and I'm giving it to you." He continued, his voice flat and defeated. "Linda and I started seeing each other whenever I was in Spokane. It was supposed to just be an affair, something temporary. But then she got pregnant. I panicked. I didn't want her to have an abortion, but I couldn't tell her about you and Jennifer either. So I told her I was divorced, that I'd been married young and it hadn't worked out. I told her I wanted to marry her and make things right." "So you committed bigamy," Linda said. "You married me knowing it was illegal, knowing you were already married." "Yes," Richard admitted. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could keep both families separate, keep both of you happy. My income was good and getting better. I could afford 2 households if I was careful. I just had to keep traveling, keep the 2 parts of my life from ever intersecting." "And you almost succeeded," I said bitterly. "For 6 years with Linda, 13 with me. How did you keep it all straight? How did you remember which lies you told to whom?" "It was exhausting," Richard said, and for the first time I heard genuine emotion in his voice. "Every day was like walking a tightrope. I had to remember everything, every story, every detail. I couldn't relax with either of you because I was always afraid I'd slip up, say the wrong thing, mention something that didn't match what I told you. I loved you both. I loved Jennifer and Emily. But I was trapped in a situation I'd created, and I didn't know how to get out without destroying everyone." "You don't get to claim you loved us," Linda said fiercely. "Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't deceive. Love doesn't steal years of someone's life by pretending to be something you're not." "What about our vows, Richard? What about the promises we made in front of God and our families? Those vows were meaningless to you. You were already married when you stood at the altar with me." "I'm sorry," Richard said, and tears were running down his face now. "I know sorry isn't enough. I know I've destroyed everything. But I am sorry. I never wanted to hurt any of you." "Then you shouldn't have married Linda while you were married to me," I said. "You should have gotten a divorce first if you wanted to start a new life. You should have been honest instead of taking the coward's way out and lying to everyone." We sat there in that living room, the 3 of us, and the weight of what had been revealed pressed down on us. Upstairs, Emily was playing, innocent of the fact that her entire world was about to change. Back in Portland, Jennifer was at my mother's house, equally innocent, equally vulnerable. 2 little girls who were about to learn that their father was not the man they thought he was, and that they had a sister they'd never known about. "What happens now?" Richard finally asked. "That's up to us," Linda said, looking at me. "Margaret and I have talked about this. We have decisions to make and you don't get a vote. You gave up that right when you lied to us for years." "We could go to the police," I said. "Bigamy is a crime, Richard. You could go to prison." Richard's face went even paler. "But we're not going to do that, at least not yet," Linda added. "Because that would hurt our daughters more than it would hurt you. They don't deserve to grow up with a father in prison, with the stigma of what you've done following them for the rest of their lives." "So what then?" Richard asked, and I heard a flicker of hope in his voice. Hope that maybe he could somehow salvage something from this disaster. "You're going to do exactly what we tell you to do," I said firmly. "First, you're going to consult with a lawyer about how to legally dissolve this mess you've created. I assume our marriage, since it came first, is the legal one. Linda's marriage to you is void because you were already married. Richard nodded miserably. That means Linda and Emily have no legal protections, I continued. No claim on your income, your pension, your insurance. That's unconscionable. So you're going to make sure they're provided for. You're going to set up trust funds, insurance policies, whatever it takes to ensure that Linda and Emily are taken care of financially. And you're going to do it immediately. But how? Richard asked. I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. You'll figure it out, Linda said coldly. Take out loans. Cash in investments. Sell whatever you have to sell. Margaret and I have discussed this and we're agreed. Emily deserves the same financial security that Jennifer has as your legitimate daughter. The fact that our marriage isn't legal doesn't mean you get to abandon your responsibilities to her. You're also going to tell your employer what you've done, I added. You're going to resign from your job before they fire you, which they will once this comes out. Bigamy doesn't look good for a company's reputation. You'll need to find new employment, something that doesn't require travel so we always know where you are. Richard looked stricken. My career will be over. My reputation will be destroyed. Yes, I said without sympathy. It will. That's the consequence of your choices. Linda and I both have to figure out how to rebuild our lives and support our children. You'll have to do the same. And there's one more thing, Linda added. Jennifer and Emily. They need to meet. They need to know they have a sister. We're going to introduce them carefully, appropriately, in a way that doesn't traumatize them more than necessary. And you're going to support that relationship. You're going to facilitate it. Because regardless of what you've done, they deserve to know each other. How am I supposed to tell Emily that her father has another daughter? Richard asked desperately. How do I explain this to her? The same way I have to explain it to Jennifer, I said. Honestly and accepting full responsibility for your actions. You're going to tell both of them the truth in age-appropriate language, and you're going to answer their questions, and you're going to deal with their anger and their hurt. You created this situation, Richard. Now you get to live with the consequences. We continued talking for another hour, working through the practical details of how we would move forward. Richard would file for divorce from me immediately to clear up the legal situation. He would provide financial documentation showing all his assets and income, so we could determine fair support for both families. He would move out of both houses and find his own apartment, somewhere neutral where he could have visitation with both daughters. Linda and I would remain in our respective homes with our daughters. We would coordinate carefully how and when to tell the girls about each other, and we would support each other through the difficult process of helping them adjust to their new reality. By the time we finished, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years. So did Linda. I suspected I looked the same. Upstairs, Emily had fallen asleep, and Linda had checked on her several times during our conversation, making sure she was settled. You need to leave now, Linda told Richard. Tonight. Get your things and go to a hotel. I don't want you here when Emily wakes up. I need time to process this before I have to explain it to her. Richard stood up slowly. Where will I go? What will I tell my company? That's your problem, I said. You're good at creating stories. I'm sure you'll think of something. Just remember that Linda and I will be comparing notes from now on. Any lie you tell one of us will be immediately shared with the other. Your days of playing us against each other are over. Richard gathered his belongings from around the house, moving like a man in a daze. Linda and I watched him, making sure he took everything, leaving no trace of his presence for Emily to question in the morning. At the door he turned back to us. I really am sorry, he said one last time. I know you don't believe me, but I do love you both. I love all my children. I just made terrible choices and I don't know how to fix them. You can't fix them, Linda said quietly. You can only try to minimize the damage going forward. That's all any of us can do now. Richard left, and Linda and I stood at the window watching his car pull out of the driveway. For better or worse, we'd just become allies in ways neither of us could have imagined 24 hours earlier. Are you okay? I asked Linda. No, she replied honestly. But I will be. We both will. We have to be for our daughters. I hugged her then, and she hugged me back. Two women bound together by betrayal, and by determination to protect the children we loved. I'll call you tomorrow, I told her. We need to start planning how to tell them. Linda nodded. Together, she said. We do this together from now on. Together, I agreed. and somehow we'll all survive this. The following weeks were among the hardest of my entire life. I returned to Portland the next day and picked up Jennifer from my mother's house. She ran to me with such joy, chattering about all the fun she'd had with Grandma, and my heart broke knowing what I was about to put her through. I waited 3 days before sitting her down. Richard had agreed to be present for the conversation, and he drove up from the small apartment he'd rented in Salem, halfway between his two former lives. Jennifer sat between us on the sofa, her face bright with happiness at having both parents together. She had no idea her world was about to shatter. "Sweetheart," I began, taking her hand in mine, "Daddy and I need to talk to you about something very important. Something that's going to be hard to understand." Jennifer's smile faded as she looked between us, sensing the seriousness in our tones. "What's wrong? Is someone sick?" "No one's sick," Richard said, and I heard his voice shake. "But I've done something very wrong. And it's going to affect our family. I've been lying to you and your mother for a long time." Jennifer's eyes went wide with confusion and the beginning of fear. "What do you mean?" Over the next hour, we explained as gently as we could that Richard had been living 2 separate lives. That he had another family in Spokane. That Jennifer had a sister named Emily who was 5 years old. That Richard and I were getting divorced. Jennifer's reactions came in waves. First disbelief, insisting we must be joking or mistaken. Then anger, screaming at Richard that he was a liar and she hated him. Then tears, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe while I held her and let her cry herself out. The questions came later, once the initial shock had passed. "Did you ever love us? Are you going to leave forever? Why wasn't I enough? Does this mean Emily is more important than me?" Each question was a knife to my heart, and I could see Richard struggling to answer honestly while trying to provide some comfort. "I loved you from the moment you were born," he told Jennifer. "I still love you. None of this is your fault. You are enough. You've always been enough. This is about my failures, not anything you did or didn't do. But if you loved us, why did you have another family?" Jennifer demanded through her tears. That's the question Richard couldn't answer in any way that made sense to a 9-year-old child. He tried to explain about making bad choices, about things becoming complicated, but his words fell flat. The truth was there was no good explanation for what he'd done, no way to make it comprehensible to the daughter he'd betrayed. The one thing Jennifer latched onto was Emily. She wanted to know everything about this sister she'd never known existed. What does she look like? What does she like to do? Does she know about me? Linda was having similar conversations with Emily in Spokane, and we spoke on the phone every evening, comparing notes, supporting each other through the impossibly difficult task of helping our daughters process this trauma. Emily's reactions had been similar to Jennifer's, the same cycle of disbelief, anger, and grief. But like Jennifer, she was curious about her sister. Linda and I agreed to wait a month before arranging a meeting. We wanted to give both girls time to adjust to the idea before adding the complexity of actually meeting. Richard filed for divorce as promised, and the legal process of untangling his double life began. The pharmaceutical company did indeed fire him once they learned what he'd done. The scandal was too great, the liability too high. Richard found work as a sales clerk at a hardware store. A massive step down from his previous position, but it was honest work and it kept him close enough to maintain relationships with both daughters. He moved into a modest apartment in Oregon City, roughly equidistant from Portland and Spokane, though still closer to us. The financial settlements were complicated. As the legal wife, I had rights to Richard's pension and benefits, but Linda and Emily had moral claims that couldn't be ignored. With lawyers involved, we worked out an arrangement where Richard's assets would be divided, his future earnings garnished to support both households, and trust funds established for both girls' education. It wasn't perfect and nobody was entirely happy, but it was fair given the impossible situation. 6 weeks after that terrible confrontation in Linda's living room, we arranged for Jennifer and Emily to meet. Linda drove to Portland with Emily, and we met at a neutral location, a park with a playground where the girls could have space to interact naturally. I was nervous as we waited, holding Jennifer's hand while she fidgeted beside me. She'd been asking questions about Emily constantly, alternating between excitement at having a sister and resentment at the circumstances that had created this relationship. When Linda's car pulled up and Emily climbed out, I heard Jennifer's sharp intake of breath. The two girls stared at each other across the parking lot. They looked different, Emily with her mother's blonde coloring and softer features, Jennifer with her dark hair and my green eyes, but there was something in their expressions, in the way they held themselves, that marked them as sisters. They both had inherited Richard's intensity, that quality of complete focus when something captured their attention. Linda and I stood back, letting the girls approach each other at their own pace. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then Emily said softly, "You're Jennifer." Jennifer nodded. "You're Emily." Another pause, then Emily asked, "Do you like butterflies?" Jennifer tilted her head, considering. "I like ladybugs better, but butterflies are pretty." "Why?" "Because butterflies can be any color they want," Emily said seriously. "They can be blue or orange or even clear." "That's amazing." "I have a book about butterflies at home," Jennifer offered. "Do you want to see it?" Emily's face lit up. "Really? Can I?" "Sure," Jennifer said. "Maybe you can come over sometime." That simple exchange broke the ice. The girls moved toward the playground equipment, and soon they were playing on the swings and slides, their initial awkwardness giving way to the natural ease of children. Linda and I sat on a bench nearby, watching them and occasionally catching each other's eyes with expressions of relief and amazement. "They're going to be okay," Linda said quietly. "Think so," I agreed. "They're handling this better than we are." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two women who'd been thrust into an impossible situation and were finding their way through it together. "Margaret," Linda said suddenly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. For what you've done, for how you've handled this. You could have destroyed me. You had every right to hate me and Emily, to make our lives miserable. Instead, you've been kind and fair, and you've helped me figure out how to protect my daughter." I looked at her and saw the sincerity in her eyes. "Linda," I said gently, "you didn't do anything wrong. You were deceived just like I was. Emily is innocent. How could I punish either of you for Richard's sins? Besides," I added with a small smile, "I think we make a pretty good team." Linda laughed, a sound of genuine amusement despite everything we'd been through. Who would have thought? The first wife and the second wife becoming friends. If someone had told me this a year ago, I would have said they were crazy. Over the following months, we developed a routine. Jennifer and Emily would have playdates once or twice a month, alternating between Portland and Spokane. Linda and I would coordinate schedules, make sure both girls were comfortable, facilitate their growing relationship. Richard had visitation with both girls, carefully scheduled so he could maintain connections with both daughters. It wasn't a traditional family structure by any means, but it worked for us. Jennifer and Emily grew closer as the months passed. They discovered they both loved reading and would exchange books between visits. They both had a talent for art and would create pictures for each other. They wrote letters back and forth, the kind of rambling, enthusiastic letters that children write when they have so much to say they can barely get it all down on paper. Watching their relationship develop brought healing to Linda and me as well. If our daughters could find joy and connection despite the circumstances of their relationship, surely we adults could find our own path forward. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 1980. I was officially single again after 13 years of marriage. It felt strange to be Margaret Foster again instead of Margaret Callahan, to have that chapter of my life closed. But with the ending came a sense of freedom I hadn't expected. I was no longer tied to Richard's lies, no longer waiting for him to come home from mysterious trips, no longer questioning whether he was being truthful. My life was my own again. Linda and I continued to grow closer. What had started as a practical alliance born of necessity evolved into genuine friendship. We discovered we had much in common beyond our shared connection to Richard. We both loved mystery novels and would trade recommendations. We both enjoyed gardening and would share tips about dealing with the challenging growing conditions in our respective climates. We both were fiercely devoted to our daughters and determined to give them the best possible lives despite the trauma they'd experienced. One Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after that first terrible discovery, Linda and I were sitting in my kitchen while Jennifer and Emily played upstairs. We were planning Emily's 6th birthday party and trying to decide whether it would be too awkward to have it be a joint celebration with both families present. As we discussed the logistics, I suddenly realized something that made me laugh out loud. Linda looked at me curiously. "What's funny?" "I was just thinking," I said, "about how we've spent the last year managing schedules and coordinating plans and making sure everyone's needs are met. We're basically co-parenting, Linda. We're functioning as a parenting team." Linda considered this, then started laughing too. You're right. We are. And we're probably doing it better than Richard ever managed to parent with either of us individually. We've created this weird, unconventional family that somehow works. Maybe that's the silver lining, I mused. Richard's betrayal was horrible, but it brought us together. Jennifer has a sister she adores. Emily has a sister who looks out for her. You and I have a friend who understands what we've been through in a way no one else could. We've built something good out of something terrible. Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I know you, Margaret. Not glad about the circumstances, but glad our paths crossed. Me too, I replied honestly. Jennifer graduated from elementary school that spring and started middle school in the fall. Emily started first grade. Both girls were thriving despite the upheaval in their lives. They'd absorbed our message that their father's choices were not a reflection on them, that they were loved and valued, that families come in all different forms and theirs just happened to be more complicated than most. Richard remained a presence in their lives, though diminished from the central figure he'd once been. The girls saw him regularly but no longer idealized him. They understood now that people could be flawed, that adults made mistakes, that love didn't always look the way you expected it to. Years passed. Jennifer went to high school, then college. Emily followed the same path 6 years behind. Linda and I remained close, talking on the phone several times a week, visiting regularly, celebrating holidays together. We watched our daughters grow into remarkable young women, intelligent and compassionate and resilient. They maintained their close relationship throughout, truly sisters in every way that mattered despite the unusual circumstances of their connection. Now at 79, I can look back on that terrible discovery in Spokane and see it not as the end of my life but as a turning point towards something better. I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I learned that betrayal doesn't have to define you, that you can choose how you respond to life's cruelest blows. I learned that family isn't always about blood or legal documents, but about the people who show up for you, who support you, who love you through the darkest times. Linda passed away 3 years ago, taken too soon by cancer. Losing her was like losing a sister, and I grieved deeply. But I was there with her at the end, holding her hand just as she'd held mine through so many difficult moments. Emily was there too, and Jennifer flew in from across the country to say goodbye to the woman who'd helped raise her in so many ways. At Linda's funeral, Emily asked me to speak. I stood before the gathered mourners and talked about the extraordinary woman Linda had been, about her grace and strength, about how she transformed what could have been a relationship of bitterness and rivalry into one of friendship and mutual support. I talked about how she'd put her daughter's needs above her own pain, how she'd chosen forgiveness over revenge, how she'd built a life of purpose and meaning despite the betrayal she'd suffered. After I finished speaking and returned to my seat, Emily hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for loving my mother. Thank you for being her friend when she needed one most." I hugged her back. This woman who'd once been the child I'd resented before I knew her, the symbol of my husband's betrayal. Now she was simply Emily, someone I loved dearly, someone who felt like family in the truest sense. Jennifer sat beside us, tears streaming down her face, grieving for the woman who'd been like a second mother to her. Richard is still alive, living in a retirement community in Eugene. He's 82 now, his health declining, and both girls visit him occasionally more out of duty than affection. He never remarried, never rebuilt his life in any meaningful way. The weight of what he'd done, the families he'd fractured, the trust he'd destroyed, it broke something in him that never healed. I don't hate him anymore. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend on better things. But I don't forgive him either. Some betrayals are too profound for forgiveness, even with the passage of decades. What I've learned, what I hope to pass on to anyone who hears this story, is that life will surprise you in both terrible and wonderful ways. The same event that shatters your world can also crack it open to possibilities you never imagined. The person you think is your enemy might become your greatest ally. The situation that seems hopeless might contain the seeds of unexpected joy. When I discovered Richard's double life, I thought my story was ending. Instead, it was just beginning. A new chapter where I was the author, where I made the choices, where I determined what my life would look like. That journey led me to Linda, to a friendship I never expected, to watching my daughter gain a sister she treasures. It led me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, to build a life I'm proud of, to understand that resilience isn't about never falling down, but about always getting back up. Jennifer is 45 now, a successful architect with children of her own. Emily is 39, a teacher who works with troubled youth, helping them navigate difficult family situations with the wisdom she gained from her own experiences. My grandchildren call Emily their aunt and think nothing of it. They don't know the complicated history, the betrayal and pain that brought their family together. They just know they have people who love them, an extended network of care and support. And isn't that what family is supposed to be? I've lived long enough now to see that the story we tell ourselves about our lives is constantly being rewritten. What seemed like tragedy becomes the foundation for growth. What felt like an ending becomes a beginning. The question isn't whether life will knock you down, because it will. The question is what you'll build when you stand back up. I chose to build bridges instead of walls, to seek understanding instead of revenge, to create connection instead of division. And I'm here to tell you 3 decades later that those were the right choices. Not easy choices, not painless choices, but right ones. So if you're facing betrayal, if your world has been shattered, if everything you thought you knew has turned out to be a lie, know this. You will survive. You will heal. And if you're brave enough, if you're willing to do the hard work, you might even discover that there's beauty waiting on the other side of your pain. You might find friendship in unexpected places, strength you didn't know you had, joy in circumstances you never imagined. That's what I found. And that's what I wish for anyone walking a similar path. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story. I hope it brings you comfort, or wisdom, or at least the knowledge that you're not alone in your struggles. We all carry burdens. We all face betrayals. But we also all have the capacity to choose how we respond, to determine what kind of person we'll be in the face of life's cruelties. Choose kindness when you can. Choose courage when you must. And always choose to keep moving forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.